Yes. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this ISS seminar, which is looking at the ANC's policy conference, which, as you all know, was concluded yesterday. It was an unusual week. It was 6 days of the ANC, in a sense, doing a great deal of introspection, and some might call it navel gazing. And so we're going to try and unpick some of what we heard over the past 6 days. And it's great for me to have a wonderful panel whom I will introduce you to in a minute. I'm Judith February from the Institute for Security Studies. We are live streaming this, and so we welcome all our online viewers to this seminar as well. We're also tweeting, so I'd encourage you to tweet hashtag ANC policy. So to introduce the panel to you, on my far right, which is no indication of his politics, is Ebrahim. Well, I don't know. Ebrahim. It's been a long. Ebrahim and I used to be colleagues, and so maybe things have changed since he left Udasa. Ebrahim Fakir, who is political analyst and director of programs at ASRI, and Moiponi Malafani, who is the political editor of The Sowetan, and then Mondi Makanya, editor of City Press, the humble newspaper man. The way we're going to structure this conversation is I'm going to give each of our panelists 5 to 7 minutes to provide us with some of their thoughts on the ANC policy conference, what they thought the major takeaways were, and we all know what's on everybody's lips this morning, the economy, it seems, and the Reserve Bank, but there are other things that happened as well. So they'll have 5 to 7 minutes. We'll then have a conversation between us and bounce it around, and then I will open it up to the floor for a question and answer session. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming. And we haven't agreed as to who would go first. So Mondi
the far right, I think.
It's you. No, the far right has been having a hard time of late. So Mondi, it's over to you.
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, for me, the great shock of it all is why you have this 5 days anyway, to begin with.
Yes, it's 6.
Because,
5, yeah.
You know, because when this current government came in, when the Zuma administration came in 2009, they immediately set up the National Planning Commission. They've got 25 bright minds together who went about drawing up a diagnostic report, and after that they went about drawing up the national plan. The national plan was adopted by cabinet, it was adopted by parliament, endorsed by all political parties, most political parties, most sections of society. And then in December 2012 at the Mangaung conference, the ANC adopted the national development plan. So the NDP is the primary policy blueprint of the African National Congress. And then what happens this year is that they draw up these discussion documents, which a lot of them basically are very much in the realm of theory and very divorced from what actually the 2030 objectives of the NDP are. So my thing was, why don't you take the NDP and actually look at what the NDP is, break up into commissions, fine, and basically work out like how far have we gone with the NDP? Are we doing it properly? Is there a place where we need to tweak and change? And then that for me would have been a much more productive use of the 6 days than arguing about whether monopoly capital has a color or and so on. It's, I mean, yeah, kind of like engaging in 1930s, 1950s theoretical discussions. So for me, that was the first thing. And then secondly, I think one thing you could not run away from is the fact that the policy conferences now are used a lot as has been said, that they are essentially proxy wars for what is to happen in December. Because in all the discussions, people just divided almost in half. I believe in this because I'm going with this candidate. I believe in this because I'm going with this candidate. Which does not necessarily mean that these two candidates are necessarily ideologically apart themselves. I mean, they actually belong to the same school, but that's just, it just become that kind of proxy war. But I think just before you silence me.
No,
Oh,
I'll
I'm
never
still
do that. You've still got another 2 minutes.
Okay. Okay, thanks. I think obviously the big thing was the economy, and then the bigger story was what it told us about what's going to happen in December. So I think it was a sense, a chance for the different factions to size each other up and see how they are balanced, how the balance of forces are. And then the president's closing address, where he came out and said, and I believe he was trying to say, I'm now offering leadership, and I'm uniting this organization, which has been ironically very disunited since he himself kind of ran for office. I think that issue of how the top six the top structure, it may not be the top six, is going to be structured, is going to be the big talking point over the next 3 to 6 months.
Wadley, thank you very much. I mean, actually, I had a sort of small list of questions, and one of my questions was, where is the NDP? So you've taken us right into that. Moiponi?
I think we should, I'll just start with a bit of a background to remember that policy conference happens 6 months before the elective conference, and whatever that they decide on will be finally decided at a national conference in December whether to be implemented or not. And the last policy conference in 2012, President Jacob Zuma did not win on many policies, like his faction did not win, and this time around is the same thing, they did not win. But what we saw in his closing address is he's even more worried about what is going to happen in December, because he has already said Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is ready to lead. And now he comes out to say whoever that loses in December maybe must be deputy president. Clearly, the president normally is arrogant. Clearly, the president normally is confident. But yesterday he gave a different line, marching orders, and under the thing that he's preaching unity. But with the conference, my disappointment is how the factions flooded the economic commission, where they were fighting about whether there's white monopoly capital or there's monopoly capital, the issue of land, the mining charter that is being contested, and I think the mining bosses have taken the charter to court. Now, everyone went into that commission. They had a line. The arguments were or the discussion or the debate were very poor, because delegates, for instance, from KZN and the Youth League, they were just told, you're going to fight for expropriation of land without compensation. They could not debate beyond to say, why are they saying that? And also on the issue of, what's the other thing? Of the white monopoly capital. It was more of, it's white. They were not even looking at which industries and so on. But my disappointment is on the conference not touching on the recession. As much as the conference is about those policies that they agree on, they will be taken to December. Almost everyone who's in government, who's running this country, from the premiers to ministers to MECs that are in charge for economy from different provinces, were at that conference. And at no point, I think ANC, I'm disappointed, they were supposed maybe to have a special commission that deals with the recession. And then they say, whatever that we have decided here, it could be short-term goals. In December, when we meet, we can assess and say, what have we achieved and how do we go forward? Especially because in January there will be ANC Lekgotla and then Cabinet Lekgotla. So recession was not part of any of the discussion. It was not raised by President Jacob Zuma in his opening address. It wasn't even raised during the closing address. And my understanding is in that Economic Transformation Commission, he spoke, but he didn't touch anything that has to do with the economy. He spoke about what he said mostly in his closing address. The other thing, the Women's League wants to push for a woman president. And my disappointment with them also
with male
is,
experts
and with
on
male
hand.
experts,
Yes.
why the monopoly capital is male dominated. And that was not, they never raised anything about where are women, whether it's white women, where are they in this monopoly capital space. So yeah, that's where I will end.
Thank you very much, Moponi. Ibrahim Fakir.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm frankly quite surprised that after 6 days, you guys still want to talk about it.
Everyone's checked out.
I certainly don't. But, you know, because Judith basically forced me and my friend Gareth works here, I felt compelled to do so. You'll notice that I'm also the only one dressed as a representative of white monopoly capital. So I presume I have to speak on their behalf. Judith, I have 7 points to make.
7?
Yeah, I'm afraid 7. So I want to start off where my colleagues left off. And that is to say that, look, I think I'm going to be more charitable than my colleague Montley, who's on my left, ideologically speaking. And he's not so humble a newspaper man. But, so I'm going to be more charitable than he is and say that I think it's appropriate for parties to have these kind of policy conferences if they spoke about policy, and we know they didn't talk much about it. Parties do need these exercises as a visioning exercise, and it's not entirely inappropriate even to have documents like strategy and tactics, because it must try and give you a blueprint to where you see your party wanting to go. So I'm not entirely sure that it's inappropriate to do so, but there are open questions about whether it's appropriate to have done so in the form that the ANC did so on this occasion. That said, they began this policy conference on the back foot, in the sense that a serious body of opinion within the ANC, the veterans, basically called into question the first 2 days of its attempt to self-introspect. And that's literally where everything went wrong. Because literally, the 2 days of self-introspection was less self-introspection and more blaming. So the ANC came across at the end of these 2 days of self-introspection as the blameless victim. So it was everyone else's fault. It's the voters' fault because they've lost trust in the ANC without asking the question for why voters have lost trust in the ANC. Then they say that they have an organizational diagnostic report, and the Secretary General calls it a bitter pill, bitter medicine. When I read the report, I thought, gosh, this is quite sweet, actually. If I were an ANC member, I would think, we've done everything right and everyone else has done everything wrong. So, you know, the citizenry has lost trust in us, but we don't want to know, we don't really want to introspect for why they've lost trust in us. Secondly, everyone else wants to undermine us. So there's an attempt for a color revolution. People are taking to the streets and they're doing so for all the wrong reasons, when in fact they should just trust us because we're legitimate. And the point they missed theoretically is that if you erode your credibility, and there's a symbiotic relationship between credibility and legitimacy. So you can have a reduction in credibility, but you can still maintain your legitimacy, which is what in fact the ANC has done. It's hard to argue that the ANC is not a legitimate authority in power. But certainly, its erosion of credibility over the last decade, and I would say a decade, and I can point out why it's lost credibility over a decade, now means that it stands at the precipice where its legitimacy is in fact in question. And it is in question not just as a political party, but it is in question as a political party in government. So, when this diagnostic happened, they said the citizenry lost trust in us. It lost trust in us because we were, for 2 reasons. We were slow to respond, we were unresponsive. And that unresponsiveness is evidenced in the results of the 2016 election. The second, and the president made this admission in his opening speech, was that we were too slow to respond on Nkandla. But again, the point the public debate and the ANC misses is that irrespective of whether you've complied with what the Constitutional Court has said about the remedial action, is it okay for any one individual, and this is squarely an ethical question, not a compliance question, is it okay for any individual, whether president or not, to benefit to the tune, excluding the 10 million, to the tune of 240 million? So the question I'm making this proposal, some free advice for government, is that there ought to be a limit to the benefit that accrues to anyone in public office. We're not questioning that they're entitled to a benefit. It's the extent of the benefit that I'm questioning. So that's just from a policy point of view. Second is, I would agree with Mondli that this was a sizing up exercise. So everyone's trying to see who's saying what and on what basis, and then calculate, are those people reachable and available to us to lobby post this policy conference in the lead up to the elective conference. So it was a gauging exercise of who's there and who's not. And clearly, and this is where I differ with Moponi and Mondli, is that I think it's true to the extent that this was an exercise of sizing up and a series of proxy debates. But the proxy debates didn't follow the path of logic that it did for the past two National General Councils or the past two policy conferences. And I say so for one particular reason. Nehawu, which is a cohort of COSATU, says we support Cyril Ramaphosa for the presidency, right? And Cyril Ramaphosa comes across or puts himself up as a constitutionalist. So I'm the guy who's for rule-bound governance. I'm for upholding the Constitution. I'm for compliance-led government, and I'm for radical economic transformation in an incremental, reformist, and prudent way. That's what he says. But Nehawu, who endorse him, actually question the constitutional dispensation. So 2 days before the policy conference started, they said, we're not sure that this constitutional democracy actually works for us. And I think that there was a little more subtlety and sophistication in the way in which the delegates approached their take on each of the debates. That's not to say that it was always substantive, but it is to say that there's some contradictory emerging patterns around who people support and what ideological positions they support. So it's not as stark as it might have been from 2005. In 2005, I just think that there was a happy coincidence between the fact that Thabo Mbeki was saying all the wrong things on policy, on the economy, on HIV/AIDS, on the form of the alliance, etc. And it so happened that Zuma was championing all the right things. So we don't need jobless growth. We need some other kind of intervention in the economy. We need infrastructure-led growth. We need greater state spending. We don't need the austerity measures that Mbeki had put in place. I'm going to end, Judith. I can see you getting fidgety. And so it so happened that there was a happy coincidence between the policy proposals sponsored by Zuma and the fact that he was putting himself up for office, and the sort of anti-Mbeki sentiment was so high. So there was a happy coincidence. I think that coincidence between identity of person and policy has now unraveled a little bit. So it's a little more murky. It's a little more murky to work out what exactly is going on. But that said, if you think about the policy proposals that people championed at this policy conference, they were stark and contradictory. So the one side is all about compliance-led government, upholding the Constitution, adopting radical economic transformation in a much more prudent way without chucking out the regulatory framework. The other side wants something completely different. But which individual supports what, not at the apex, not at the top, but amongst the membership, I think is a little more murky. So that's the second general broad point I wanted to make.
You've got 5 more, but you don't have that much time.
No, I will end with this last point. The third and most striking thing for me and it relates to my first point about the ANC blaming everyone else, is that the ANC still premises itself and thinks of itself as a movement and not as a party in government. So many of the discussions were about the self-introspection of an ANC as movement rather than ANC as a party in government and what it can do. And because of that misdiagnosis of who and what it wants to be at a fundamental identity level, it started talking about things which appear anachronistic to us, and they ought to be. Because one of the legs on which they premise this is the theory of colonialism of a special type. And colonialism of a special type, we can talk about that if you like, is still appropriate for how you conceptualize who and what South Africa is and at what point in its history is. But it's insufficient because colonialism of a special type is premised on one key postulate. And that postulate is that at the time at which it was formulated in 1969 and adopted at Morogoro, was that it was premised on the idea that there are no inherent antagonisms amongst black South Africans themselves. That is no longer true as a theoretical postulate. It is impossible. The economy's moved on, the world's moved on, the polar spheres of influence both in the world and in South Africa have moved on since then. And so it leads the ANC into a cul-de-sac, because the cul-de-sac is that they are unable to identify what they call the motive forces for change in society are. And the beachhead in my understanding would be that if you believe you want to identify the motive forces, it is the state, because you want the state to lead development. But you're not identifying the state as a motive force, and so that's where you fall down, because you refuse to see yourself as the beachhead of that state, which is what you are as the governing party. And because of that, you didn't really talk, and they didn't really talk, about the substantive issues of what they can do while they're in government. So if they wanted to talk about radical economic transformation, here's some free advice for the ANC, and I will end on this, Julie, is that there are serious, concrete, radical proposals which can be considered. For example, prescriptive policy, for example, things like import substitution, for example, ring-fencing revenues from certain areas of the private sector for forced reinvestment in the economy. Those are issues which can be talked about, but they can only be talked about in an environment of high trust, high confidence, which of course the ANC has eroded over the last 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've got 4 points left, but perhaps it will come out in discussion. So thanks to all three of you for those insights. I want to take us back a little bit, because for me, this policy conference happens in a context. So the first context I want us to talk about, and I thought that the conference was particularly poor on this. Here you have a massive elephant in the room. You have, on the day of the start of the conference, the story breaks about Freda Dairy. There are all these Gupta Leaks emails coming out. At no point did we see outrage. Perhaps I missed that, but how does the ANC propose to actually deal with this elephant in the room, apart from kicking it for touch and saying this is a problem the state has to deal with? In other words, President Zuma has to appoint a commission of inquiry where he will appoint the judge and investigate, perhaps a la Willie Suriti. So for me it is that actually all of this, the policy discussions, Brian, you talk about the motive forces, but all of these policy discussions happen in a particular context of really high corruption, even more than that, state capture. What comes out of the policy conference that actually deals with that? Mondli, Moipeni?
Nothing was said about corruption. I think even the president in his closing address just said we need to fight corruption. The Gupta family were raised in some of the commissions, and in plenary, which was a closed session, there's a line that was read by Minister of Labour, where she said government cannot do business with a particular family without mentioning the family. Minister Lindwe Sisulu was interviewed, came out saying all Gupta ministers should be fired. But the problem is all ANC leaders, when you speak to them about the Guptas and what is going to happen, they say NEC came out in support that the president must establish the commission. And if he doesn't, or if it takes forever, no one will do anything about. But ANC leaders are unhappy about the Guptas and their connections and how they run government.
Is that enough, Manli?
Yeah, there was quite a curious line that I'm not sure who said it in one of the briefings. The one who said, when they were asked about, so did you deal with the Guptas, did you deal with 1, 2, 3? And then the person said, we're not here to talk about events, we're here to talk about policy.
It was at a press conference.
But events.
Yeah, which is basically a way of running around it. I think what it speaks to is just exactly like the dysfunction in the ANC at this point, and the sense of paralysis. Because the ANC knows that it cannot do anything about this massive elephant. I don't even think it's an elephant. It's it's beyond elephant. Yeah. Look, if the ANC has known about this for a long time. It's not a mystery. It's been in the media, and people in the ANC have been talking about it forever. And the fact that the ANC could not take any action about this matter in 2013 when the plane landed, the wedding plane landed at Waterkloof, that was when it should have been the point where you said, thus far, no further. And they couldn't. Then more stuff has come out. There have been more revelations. And after Mcebisi Jonas came out, again, there should have been something there. And the Secretary General of the ANC spoke very loudly about we need to do this, and we're going to establish the internal commission, which came to naught. And at each point, at each inflection and the Nkandla judgment that was spoken about, at that point again, I'm moving away from the Guptas. At that point, was that the ANC says we are going to introspect. We are going to look into ourselves and come out and self-correct. And each time they miss that opportunity to introspect. And right now, we are at this, it's the deepest crisis. I know that in 2 weeks' time or a month's time, we'll say we're in the deepest crisis. But this is a serious crisis. You have recession, you have junk status, and you have the most blatant, the most transparent evidence that this country has been captured. And the fact that the ANC could not actually find it within itself to deal with that shows you that it is totally paralyzed by the Gupta phenomenon. And a very telling thing was that fight at the beginning of conference, where there were people who did not even want to consider looking at that, what Ibrahim calls a very soft report. And the fact that they want to be blinded, and they want to close their ears to reality. I think it might be that point. I might be jumping ahead here. Look, I think the ANC has got to the point where it is on that, it's not a slippery slope, that it's a very sharp cliff. The gradient is very steep, and it really cannot rescue itself. And it had that opportunity this weekend to actually, however it came out. Because you cannot divorce policy from the ability of the organization to implement that policy.
So we'll go to the ANC's ability to renew itself. But Ibrahim, so for me, it felt like the policy conference was simply papering over the cracks. And in fact, before last Friday, we were in a crisis, and we are in a crisis. 6.6 million people unemployed by the narrow definition. As you say, junk state is the rand which is tumbling, and the private sector really under pressure, and investment under pressure. So we leave the policy conference in exactly almost the same place as we did last Friday.
Yes, unfortunately. That is precisely what I was saying.
Yeah.
We don't leave the policy conference any wiser for what the ANC wants to do, particularly on the economy. and there are things that can be done. The first is outreach to the private sector to kind of try and restore confidence. But
so
you can only
yeah.
restore confidence if you actually have something to offer. So I'm not sure that they've got anything to go to the private sector with and say that we can offer this to you. So the best sop that was made to business and to on the economy was on the debate on white monopoly capital. Because if you remember the repetition of the following word, we exist with white or otherwise, we exist with monopoly capital in the symbiotic relationship of cooperation and conflict. So they're not our friend, they can undermine the revolution, but we need them because, and here's the concession, we need them because they keep the economy going and they create jobs. So I think that was quite a clear posture that I don't think the ANC wants to, in inverted commas, discipline capital. Though it would be nice if they did, because capital's sort of committed its own egregious abuses, and KPMG and McKinsey are about the least of them. And we don't talk enough about that. So they've got nothing except for the concession. They've got nothing to go to the private sector with. And as I'm suggesting, there are things that can be bargained with the private sector.
But just to interrupt you there, I think you're right, but you can't. The bargaining has to happen in a relationship of trust. When Zuma fired Pravin Gordhan and Mcebisi Jonas, that trust, business saw that as a betrayal. That trust is broken down.
Yeah, it was broken down before that when he fired Nene.
Yeah.
So that was the first breakdown of trust. But I mean, I think we also got to ask hard questions about why we can't allow a president who has it within his authority to make the appointments that he wishes to make. Now, I'm happy to concede that the president has it in his executive power in order to do and make the appointments he does. Where we part ways where I part ways with that is that yes, it has to happen in an environment of trust and mutual confidence. Now, here's where the ANC has fallen down, and it comes back to the third headline point I make, where the ANC is looking at itself as a movement rather than party in power. Because if it looked at itself as party in power, it would discount probably 197,000 of the emails that came out of the Gupta leaks, but there are 3 on which they have to act, which they did not act on. The first is the Waterkloof landing of the Gupta aeroplane, a clear and open conflagration of the law, and theft of public resources. The second was a cabinet minister sharing cabinet information and cabinet memos with private individuals. Again, a clear breaking of the law. And the third is the Vrede Dairy thing which broke, which we've known about for quite some time. The evidence wasn't there, it's surfaced now. But where is the state? Where is the party in power? Where is the government in dealing with these? So if you just dealt with these 3 things, it would go some way to restoring confidence. And often the ANC is its own worst enemy in that sense, in that it didn't deal with this. Now, I think that there's a reason why they didn't deal with this. And the reason is because if they dealt with it, and if they took a slightly harder stance on particular issues at the policy conference, it would have precipitated the split that we think is looming in the ANC sooner than it would be coming. But basically what I think the ANC has managed to do for now is to kick to touch and to kick further down the line what inevitably must happen. Because I'm asking myself, if the picture I painted of 2 completely contradictory approaches to politics, policy and ideology are true, if my premise is correct, and I don't think I'm wrong, if that's correct, how is it that the same people can exist in the same party? Why are you there? So that's the reason why I think they just feel moribund, as Montle and Moiponi are suggesting. They're moribund because taking any action now precipitates something sooner rather than later. And they're prepared to sacrifice that principle in the pursuit of power. because there's no other route to the state other than through the ANC.
We'll talk about that later, but what is radical economic transformation? I'd just like to hear, a few lines from each of you, and then I want to go into talking about the Reserve Bank, because it seems to me as what happened yesterday in that Economic Commission report back by Enoch Godongwana was largely optics, that actually the status quo is not going to change. But what it does do is it scares off investors, it makes people jittery because it's unpredictable and it feels a little bit reckless. What is radical socio-economic transformation, Mandi?
It's a big thing.
Yes.
Very big. No,
Our
it's just...
president has never lost for words, yes.
No, look, I mean...
It's a big thing, yeah.
The people who have been using it popularly actually are the ones who have not defined it properly.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's just been rhetoric, and you just spew it out. You talk about the land, you talk about the banks, you talk about monopoly capital seizing the heights of the economy, but actually they haven't defined what it is. The people who are trying to appropriate it, which is the Cyril Ramaphosa side of the equation, are actually now starting to put
Meat on the bones.
yeah, meat on the bones, so to speak. I'm actually trying to say, if we implement 1, 2, 3, then we will achieve these particular steps. And quite interestingly, last week the BUSA, they came up with that document, which in a way kind of like embraces a form of radical socio-economic transformation by saying that, look, there are these transformative policies that we need to implement. We cannot stand still as a society. The thing is, there are policies that are in place. There are, whether it's legislative measures or whether it's administrative and regulatory, that are in place already, that need to be implemented. And if there was political will to implement those, you would go very far in actually achieving economic transformation. Yes, the BE, that various, however long your Bs are, all of those, they may be inadequate. Employment equity may be inadequate, and so on. But what they managed to do, particularly in the first 10 to 15 years of democracy, the transformation of the society that happened through that, because there was political will to implement and to hold the corporate sector to account along those. Something did begin to happen, and momentum was lost at some point. Some may argue that basically that it benefited a few, but I think that's a miserly interpretation of what actually happened, because if you see so South Africa is a different place from what it was in 1994, particularly from 1996 onwards, when these policies began to be implemented. So you've got a framework. It's a question of like how willing are you to implement, and how aggressively and how systematically you are willing to implement those particular policies. So I think it's a radical economic transformation, or radical socio-economic transformation is a nice sounding word that works for the now, because you are trying to rally people. Julius Malema came up with basically economic freedom in a lifetime. And so we also need to have something that sounds as radical as he does. I need to go back to the NDP again,
Yes.
and say you've actually got the NDP.
Yes.
And if you began to implement the NDP,
But where is the
you
NDP?
will go somewhere. Again, it's a document that's spoken about in speeches. It's nice. I mean, like, it's referred to in speeches by ministers. And
Can I just interrupt you there, Mandli, because I've got here something printed out. Cyril Ramaphosa, before the conference, he says, this is an opportunity to place our economy on a new trajectory that we as the alliance partners must come up with. And then he goes through things. So, I mean, he doesn't even mention the NDP in any of this, that he is even putting forward. So it seems as if this is just
it's not a
gathering
rallying
dust.
call.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Yeah. Yes, yeah. I mean, like, it's just something that people use when they cut a ribbon somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah. But just to go back to the role of like the trust issue
Yes, yeah.
that you spoke about. Now the ANC defines itself, and again it was repeated yesterday, kind of like in the president's closing address, it defines itself as a disciplined force of the left.
Oh.
Yeah. It's not a socialist party, it's not a communist party, it's not a Marxist-Leninist party, whatever it is. So to then have this long, convoluted debate about whether capital is the primary enemy of the National Democratic Revolution, I mean, like, that is not a discussion that's supposed to be had by what is essentially a social democratic party.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
essentially what the ANC is. And especially at a time when, I mean, since the Nene episode, there's been a process now of actually building trust between business and government. And so you cannot define a social partner as an enemy. You sit with the social partner at NEDLAC, you have your discussions.
100 CEOs, yeah.
And you are in a relationship. Yes, a relationship of tension is necessary between the partners, but it's not necessarily, you cannot have an adversarial enemy description of each other.
Moiponi, what did you come out of that as radical economic transformation?
Unfortunately, nothing. The sad thing is, it is necessary to look into the economy and have black people being players, owning at a level of ownership. But at the moment, this radical economic transformation, or whatever it is being used to fight factional battles in the ANC. So the situation is fluid as we speak. And I agree with Monty that there are good policies. If my memory serves me well, in 2014, September or 2015, government came out to say it wants to build 100 industrialists, I think.
Yes, black
through
industrialists.
DT, black industrialists. Where is that project?
Yes.
I was talking to someone from IDC, was saying to me, because IDC set billions for that project, but it says the standard is so high that some people don't qualify even if they have good ideas. You don't have money, but at the same time you have to go get someone who can help you put a proper business plan so that whatever that you want to do makes sense. So I'm not sure how many they have managed to, to help, or whether there are new black industrialists or not. So there are policies like Monji says, but at the end of the day, there's no will to implement. And on top of that, in the ANC or government, things are fluid. All eyes are in December. Hopefully, whoever that wins, if it's a faction that is not aligned to President Jacob Zuma, they will push on this radical economic transformation, and also they will make sure that those that are linked to the coups, they go to jail. And also that they deal with the coups. But unfortunately, they will have to, a lot will have to be done, because if we're to check the Hawks, I think they are captured, NPA, almost everywhere where you have to report issues of crime, nothing is being done. And we have an intelligence minister who says we were aware of Vuwani, but we did nothing.
Yes. Indeed. Ibrahim, so just on that radical economic transformation, and any of you can also jump in about the Reserve Bank, and we'll go there. But what struck me about the 6 days is that it was words, semantics, slogans, but that the depth was missing. So for me, the question is, where is the intellectual heart of the ANC? It's been hollowed out. Where is the battle of ideas on these issues? Moiponi and Mandli say that we've got the policies in place, but there seemed to be a layer of this kind of dangerous populism which is added to that, which I think takes us down a rabbit hole, in a sense, of paralysis.
Well, yeah, it does, and I think that diagnosis is accurate. And it's so because I think the ANC is now finding itself in a place where it has to be responsive to its left and responsive to its right, because the DA does consistently better in every election since 2009 than almost any other party. and the EFF is capturing the imagination through whether you believe the sincerity of its rhetoric or not. But that's the reality of where the ANC finds itself. It's got to talk to both. And then, of course, it's got to respond to its own undermining of itself, which it has consistently done in the state over the past decade. So, I mean, they took themselves to the cul-de-sac of where they are. And so I was struck by this debate about the Reserve Bank, because it was completely nonsensical.
Yeah.
In the one sense, you say the mandate's already codified in the Constitution. We don't want to talk about it because it's clear.
And the independence.
And
is
we don't want to
guaranteed.
meddle with the independence of the Reserve Bank either.
Of course, the public protector would argue with that. Yeah.
Well, the public protect,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'd rather I'd respond to you. Let me put it kindly. I'd respond to you, Judith, but I wouldn't respond to the public protector
I
because
don't really know how to take that.
because she's in no place to incept this debate. Not, and particularly not when a court in Nkandla judgment has said recommendations of the public protector have to be taken more seriously
Yeah.
than that. So, you know, for someone to make that recommendation in a report of the public protector is treading on dangerous ground. And you can't be unwise to the fact that the court has actually given you a mandate to have your recommendations implemented. So it's dangerous ground. But I was gobsmacked for why they wanted to talk about the changing of ownership of the Reserve Bank. None of the private shareholders, if you want to call them that, actually have influence over the decision making and the policy making
Appointments.
process and the appointments at the Reserve Bank, because the governor and the deputy governors are appointed by government, and policies are made by the governors, the deputies, in consultation with National Treasury and the Ministry of Finance. So what was the debate about? It was optics, as you say.
But it's not about economic growth. Although the other argument which people like Patrick Bond make is that, you know, the Reserve Bank can have a dual mandate like the US Fed. And so we should have that conversation. My response to that is you can't have that conversation because the environment's too toxic.
Well, quite apart from the fact that you can't have that conversation, there's other basic things that you've got to do before you have that conversation. Because there's no point in changing the mandate, even if you want, of the Reserve Bank to start doing other things than what it is doing now. So what is the point of having a debate about whether you should flood the capital market with money that you just print, or whether you should reduce or increase interest rates, when in fact the state capacity to do things in areas where you already have the functionality is so low? So if state administration is unable, particularly in DTI, in the Ministry of Finance, and all the other economic ministries, if their capacity has been so low, and I can single out one, the ministry, I don't know, what is it called, small business?
Yes.
Or whatever.
NDOC.
If those ministries have done absolutely nothing, what is the point about talking about changing the mandate of the Reserve Bank, even if you want? So it's a meaningless debate, it's a fiction.
It's a rendering.
In the absence of other real debates about ministries which have actually real power to do things to change the economic face of the society. It's not happened. But you know, your question about radical economic transformation, it depends who you're asking.
Yes.
Because the one size definition is clear. Reject the PFMA,
Yeah.
get rid of the Municipal Finance Management Act, get rid of FICA, land expropriation without any compensation, and create a state bank. On the other side, the definition of radical economic transformation is stick with the regulatory framework as is. 30% set-asides for SMMEs and black business for government procurement is sufficient and appropriate. The black industrialist program must come on stream, and then we must rebuild trust with the private sector. That's their understanding of radical economic. So it's clear, but it is divergent. And why they still exist in the same place, I don't know.
So I've got two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, to the audience for questions. The one is that it seemed as if the commissions on legislation and governance, you know, here we have, you talk about the prosecuting authority which seems to be AWOL, I mean, literally, although Sean Abrams did say the time for disrespecting the NPA is over, was very overzealous to try and charge Pravin Gordhan, but seems to be silent. So no real conversation about our democratic institutions and that they are consistently being undermined. And also on issues like health and education. You know, these education's in a major crisis in South Africa, and yet, you know, what do we hear from the ANC? It's almost as if the laziness, the sloppy intellectual sort of lack of thought, it permeates everything, and so therefore we don't get down to what we should be talking about. Anybody here? Well, Ibrahim, let me give Mondli and Moponi a chance.
Okay, stuck record.
Yes.
You'll forgive me.
It's fine. We all are, after all.
Okay. The NDP.
if nobody's talking about the NDP, Mondli Makanya is. Okay.
The NDP speaks about, it's probably the best chapter,
Yes.
It speaks about the capable state. And if you build a capable state, I'm not saying it's the panacea to everything, but you will begin to actually start to fix all those, to answer those questions about the dysfunction that's there in the prosecuting authority and other areas of government. And I think a lot of effort should have gone, a lot of time and attention in this conference should have gone into that, as to what is wrong with our public service and why is the public service not actually implementing what it's supposed to be implementing. Why are people every single day when you go to work and there's a traffic report, they'll tell you avoid that road because there's protest action. I mean, it's become part of the traffic report now, and we don't pay attention that much attention to it anymore. So as a governing party, I think very little of effort went into governance. And it's the governance that will be the implementers of whatever policy you are discussing here at the policy conference. There's just so much noise. I mean, this is the great disappointment.
Moponi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think on education, government really has to do a lot. It has to put effort. Some of the provinces at the policy conference had good inputs with regard to education, but I wasn't in the press conference where they were reporting back with regard to what they have decided. Northwest was saying they want entrepreneur skills at high school level.
Yeah.
Another province spoke about teachers not being well qualified. There must be colleges, and where I also agree with that is I think we should not allow teachers to pass from college or university with something like 50%. The standard must be high. There must, if you want to be a teacher, there must be a bar of above 65%, because how do you go teach my child mathematics when you got 50%, to qualify as a teacher? So the bar on some of the subjects should be high. And then Eastern Cape complained that most of their schools are empty. They have to close them down because parents move with their kids to Johannesburg when they get employment.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think the Department of Education, basic and higher education, as much as we accept the policies to come from the ANC, they have budget, they know what is wrong, they know what happens in government schools, in the townships and everywhere. They need to find a solution of how the districts and so on can be strict and work on ensuring that the teachers and the children are in class and change the subjects to suit kids.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ibrahim, do you want to add something to that?
Well, in the security cluster, Sean is still busy formulating reasons why he shouldn't be shafted to the president. So, I think his focus is elsewhere. The police, the Hawks, IPID is another internal fight in the security cluster, and Parliament twice over has been found by the Constitutional Court to be wanting and not fulfilling its mandate. So in Kandla judgment, that was clear. In the SASSA grants crisis scandal, that was clear too. And so I'm unsurprised then that the ANC didn't actually want to talk about itself as a party in government, because it could then evade talking about this and its inability to actually run the institutions in which it actually has full control over, to the extent that it could have addressed many of the problems that they correctly identified. So I don't think anyone would quibble with that. But the thing is, you can't address these problems if you don't take seriously the areas of function and responsibility that you already have. And this is running through as a thread in society, because if there is inconsistent application of the rules, there is inconsistent desire for compliance among senior perceived leadership, then why should ordinary people think that they should abide by the set of rules which have been put in place? Because there's no appetite for me to do that if everyone else is getting away. And that has serious implications for tax, it has serious implications for all kinds of other compliance kind of behavior. So if local government thinks it's underfunded and it's unable to raise revenue, well, why are you surprised? You know, Mondi is talking about protests, and of course there's so many of them. But what's going to happen, and I suspect this is looming already, when you start having serious raids and tax boycotts amongst a very well organized middle class. So not only are you going to have to force yourself to go to the IMF and the World Bank, which is the last thing.
Well, Mr. Gigaba has already said that this is a possibility.
Yeah. And so I'm simply alerting to the fact that this crisis might get even deeper than it currently is, because of what you will have to do, considering the inconsistency and the impunity, literally, with which people have behaved.
Okay, we need to close it off, but also, I mean, SARS, a very real possibility that people, you know, stop paying taxes. So to all three of you, I mean, I think that the time has come. You know, should the ANC simply split? The factions are irreconcilable. Should it simply split and see what happens? Should the populists go one way and the Social Democrats go the other?
Look, I mean, sentimentally, I don't think any of us would want that. I think it's the role that the ANC has played in the society and continues to play. I mean, like they speak of themselves as the glue, but it is the most sophisticated political organization, or was until 2009. But it is still the repository of a lot of thought. I mean, like, and people, and generally in society, a lot of the people who run things come from an ANC background. So I think it will be a huge loss to society to have an ANC that disintegrates. I'm not so concerned about them losing power. Yeah, but I do think that as a major player in the society, I think you still want a strong ANC that exists and competes with other parties on a fair basis. I think post 2012, I don't think you'll have a huge rupture. I think you'll continue to have what you've had. A splintering. Even now, I mean, like, I think post the conference, I think there'll be a lot more splintering. I don't think it will be a rupture, because I think there are a lot of people in the ANC who want to contest within the inside. I mean, like, they still see the outside as a bit cold. But I think the momentum that was created by COPE will continue.
My pony? And I mean, I might just add to that, you know, are they really worried that they will lose the 2019 elections, or, you know, be in a position of coalition?
Those that are not in President Jacob Zuma's camp are worried about losing 2019. Moreover, Gauteng has been blamed for losing the metros. Everybody's saying they shouldn't blame President Jacob Zuma. And I find that the leaders live in a bubble. They are not on the ground with the people. And if they were on the ground, things that we have been complaining about, the quotas and so on, I think ANC would have taken action. They are in blue lights, they don't see, and they don't talk to the people. Remember, some of them, they are not even staying in their own townships where they come from. They are now in ministerial homes, so they don't even know exactly what people feel or what they see on the ground. The split, I don't agree with Montla. I think it will be big because already SACP has said is they must start talking to different organizations. They're talking about what they call United, not United Front. I can't remember. It's United
Popular Front.
Is it United?
It's a Popular Front.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we'll see them participating in the next conference of the veterans. And then December, should President Jacob Zuma win, I think all of them, they will move out together. We may see an announcement where SACP will say we stand for the elections, and we'll see maybe Gauteng and other people are moving with them. What is important is these people who sees themselves as leaders, do they really have people that are the followers? Some say yes, we've got branches, we have this, you don't know. I think when they break, that's when we will see if they have people that will follow them from the ground. And also I think there's a move to start talking with Zwelinzima Vavi and the likes of NUMSA. Although NUMSA is still very, very angry, I'm not sure if it will be open to any discussions. So there are moves. The moves, it won't be only from the people in the ANC, it will be also with other civil society movement.
Ibrahim Fakir, last word before we open to the audience, a brief one.
There's a divergence between my emotional and analytic approach to this. Emotionally, obviously, I'm not sure I'd like to see a breakup of the ANC, but analytically, the mass democratic movement doesn't exist if you really think about it in that way. So analytically, what has happened? NUMSA is already split. So the split, Mondley, I think, is bigger than you're giving it credit for already. So you've had three attritions. You've had the UDM, COPE, and the EFF, which have come out from the rump of the ANC itself. And you've had the split of NUMSA from the broader alliance, which has happened to form its United Front. And now the ideological approaches, like I'm saying, to politics and policy are so contradictory. I can't imagine why they still exist in the same place. So, I don't know, I can't tell the future. But what was missed, and this is missed, I think, by all of us, is the changing nature of the social structure in the society. And there is a fundamental change in the social structure. So if you just think about the metros that the ANC lost, class formation over the last 20 years has been fairly significant. So you've got a sort of you've got an elite which is connected to the global circuits of power, economy, and commerce, and very highly sophisticated, quite mobile, and are serious. Then there's alongside them a well-organized working class, even though that's in decline because of COSATU's decline and the split of NUMSA, etc. So you've got an organized working class, but it is under assault not just because of the internal changes in the union movement, but also because of casualization, because of broader trends in the economy, casualization, informalization, part-time work, etc. So they are non-unionized, but they work, but they're not an organized working class. So that's three that you identify already. And that's in the rear is brought up by people on the margins, in the periphery, in the informal settlements, working in the formal sector, unemployed, etc. So you've got four different classes just in the metro. And that changing social structure is going to need different types of parties to speak for it. So there's no party at the moment which talks purely for the capitalist class. I'm saying so because I'm dressed like one. My bank balance doesn't show so, but okay. So that party doesn't exist yet. There's no party which is speaking purely for the organized working class. There's no party which is speaking purely for a marginalized underclass. So I don't know how parties are going to respond to that. But clearly, the ANC has missed a trick on this one, and they missed it in the 2016 local government elections, because they never fashioned a manifesto which can talk to that multiplicity of four different classes. How this will change, I don't know, but I'm just making that point analytically that there is a need for this kind of shift or change to happen. It has to.
Well, thanks very much to our panelists. I'm going to open it up to your questions. If you can just tell us who you are firstly, and also tell us where you're from. We're going to say goodbye to our online viewers now. Chatham House rules apply, so this will simply be, will continue as a closed meeting. So who wants to go first? We'll take the